Welcome back to Silence the Stigma Podcast, where we talk about addiction, recovery, treatment, harm reduction, and the policies that affect real people's lives. Today, I want to talk about something that I think the recovery field needs to get much more comfortable discussing, and that is who gets to decide what recovery looks like. Because we use the word recovery constantly. We work in recovery, we provide recovery services, we work with peer recovery supporters, we build recovery programs, we celebrate recovery. But what exactly are we talking about when we use that word? Does recovery mean complete abstinence from every substance that can alter your mood or mind? Does it mean no alcohol, no cannabis? What about methadone or buprenorphine? Prescription stimulants, benzodiazepines, prescription pain medication? What happens when somebody uses a medication or treatment that another person personally doesn't agree with? Do they suddenly stop being in recovery? And what happens when employment itself becomes conditional on someone stopping medical treatment? Because at that point, this stops being only a conversation about medical cannabis. It becomes a much bigger conversation about medication, stigma, disability, workplace power, patient autonomy, and whether an employer should ever be in the position of telling someone, you can have this job, but only if you stop the treatment your medical provider believes you need. Let's start somewhere more objective than personal opinion. Samsha defines recovery as a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential. That matters. Notice what isn't in that definition. It doesn't say recovery means never taking a psychoactive medication. It doesn't say recovery means complete abstinence from every substance. It doesn't say recovery only counts if you follow one particular program. And it definitely doesn't say recovery is whatever another person decides it should look like. Samsha also describes recovery as highly personal and occurring through many pathways. Those pathways can include clinical treatment, medication, peer support, family support, faith-based approaches, self-care, and other approaches. That language matters as it's highly personal, many pathways, and if we believe those words, then they have to apply even when someone's pathway makes us uncomfortable. This is where conversations can get heated. For some people, recovery absolutely means total abstinence, and there is nothing wrong with that. Somebody may say, I cannot safely use alcohol, cannabis, opioids, or anything else. Complete abstinence is what keeps me alive, and that is valid, but that may be exactly what recovery needs to look like for that person. But there is a huge difference between saying, this is what my recovery requires, and saying, therefore, this is what everybody else's recovery must require. Those are not the same statement. The recovery field has spent decades learning this lesson with medications for opioid use disorder. There was a time when someone taking methadone was routinely told, you're not really sober, you just replaced one drug with another, you're still dependent, and we still hear those things today. Then the same argument was made about buprenorphine, and we had to start separating physical dependence from addiction. We had to start separating medication use from compulsive drug use. And we had to recognize that a person can take a psychoactive controlled medication and still be unquestionably engaged in recovery. So why does that reasoning suddenly disappear when the treatment happens to be cannabis? We need to be accurate here because medical cannabis exists in an unusual regulatory environment. Traditional prescription medications usually go through the FDA approval process. A developer studies a specific drug, determines formulation and dosing, conducts clinical trials, and submits evidence to the FDA. The FDA then evaluates that specific product for safety, effectiveness, manufacturing quality, labeling, and its proposed medical indication. Cannabis sold through state medical marijuana programs did not enter medicine through that same pathway. States created medical cannabis programs through their own laws and regulatory systems. The FDA has not approved cannabis as a treatment for a particular disease or condition. It has, however, approved specific cannabinoid-containing medications that contain certain synthetic cannabinoid products. So when somebody says medical marijuana isn't FDA approved, that statement requires context. It is correct if the cannabis products commonly purchased through state dispensaries are not FDA approved prescription drugs in the same manner as a traditional prescription medication. But what that does not logically follow is, therefore, anyone who uses medical cannabis cannot be in recovery. Those are two completely different questions. One is about drug regulation. The other is about recovery. So let's use it in a realistic example. Imagine two people working in the recovery field. Person A has opiate use disorder. They are stable on methadone. They also have ADHD and take prescribed stimulant. Maybe they take another controlled medication under medical supervision. Maybe they haven't returned to harmful opioid use. They're working, they're raising their family, they're helping other people, they're stable. Most modern treatment professionals would hopefully recognize this person can absolutely be in recovery. Now take person B. They have a history of substance use disorder. They haven't returned to the drug that was destroying their life. They're stable, they're working, they're raising their family, they're actively engaged in recovery, but they use cannabis through their state's medical program for medical conditions. And somebody says, you're not in recovery. Why? That's the question. Not whether everybody should use cannabis, not whether cannabis is completely harmless, not whether someone can develop cannabis use disorder. The question is, what clinical principle makes person A's recovery legitimate and person B's automatically illegitimate? If the answer is simply because I don't believe people in recovery should use marijuana, then we are no longer talking about individualized clinical assessment. We are talking about a personal belief. Saying medical cannabis can coexist with recovery does not mean cannabis is harmless. Cannabis can cause impairment. People can develop cannabis use disorder. It can worsen symptoms for some individuals. It can negatively affect cognition, mental health, driving ability, employment, relationships, and other areas of functioning. For somebody with a history of addiction, cannabis could potentially become part of a harmful pattern. So, yes, treatment professionals should ask about it. Should we assess it? Should we talk about frequency? Should we talk about impairment? Should we talk about why the person is using it? We should talk about whether they are experiencing consequences. We should talk about whether it affects their recovery goals. But here's the important part. Assessment is not the same thing as an automatic disqualification from recovery. If someone is taking a prescribed benzodiazepine, we do not determine whether they have a benzodiazepine use disorder simply by finding benzos in their urine. If someone is prescribed a stimulant, the presence of an amphetamine on a drug screen does not automatically establish stimulant use disorder. If someone is prescribed an opiate after surgery, we do not automatically say they have relapsed. Context matters and behavior matters. Loss of control matters, consequences matter, functioning matters, diagnostic criteria matter. So why would cannabis be the one substance where we suddenly stop asking those questions? Now let's take this conversation further. Because this is not only about cannabis. What happens when an employer says, you can have this job, but only if you stop your medication? That could mean cannabis. It could also mean methadone, buprenorphine, a stimulant, a benzo, pain medication, psychiatric medication, or some other medical treatment. At that point, we need to separate two very different concepts. An employer has a legitimate interest in whether an employee can safely perform the essential functions of a job, correct? That can include questions about actual impairment. It can include legitimate safety, sensitive requirements. It can include drug-free workplace rules. It can include certain regulatory standards, but that is not the same thing as saying we get to decide whether you should continue your medical treatment. That is a completely different level of involvement. Think about the difference between these two statements. You cannot perform this safety-sensitive job while impaired. That can be a legitimate workplace requirement. Or, you must stop taking your medication before we will employ you. Now, we have moved from regulating workplace conduct into potentially dictating healthcare. The appropriate question should usually be, can this individual perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. Not, does management personally approve of the treatment plan? And that matters. If someone is falling asleep while transporting clients, that is a safety issue. If someone is confused while administering medication, that is a safety issue. If someone is impaired while operating machinery, that's a safety issue. Address the impairment. Address the actual risk. Address the essential job function. But if somebody is performing the job safely and effectively, then saying, we still want you to stop the medication because we don't agree with it, raises a much different set of concerns. This is where employment starts entering the conversation. Employment law. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers generally cannot discriminate against a qualified person because of a disability. The ADA also requires covered employers to consider reasonable accommodation unless doing so would create an undue hardship. And during the employment, medical injuries generally have to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. Oh, medical inquiries. My bad. That does not mean the employer does not simply have unlimited authority to investigate or control someone's medical treatment. There can also be a concept known as direct threat. An employer may act when an employee presents a significant safety risk, but that analysis is supposed to be individualized and based on objective evidence. It should not be, people who take this medication make me nervous. It should be, here is the job function, here is the evidence, here is the actual safety concern. That is a much higher standard than personal discomfort. There's another layer here too. Employers do not generally get unrestricted access to every medication an employee takes. Asking employees about prescription medications can itself become a disability-related medical inquiry. There are circumstances where limited inquiries can be lawful, especially in genuinely safety-sensitive roles. But there is a major difference between, we need your provider to confirm that you can safely perform these specific job duties, and give us a list of every medication you take so management can decide whether we approve. One is tied to job function. The other starts to look like unnecessary intrusion into healthcare. And if an employer lawfully receives medical information, that information is generally expected to be kept confidential. Methadone and buprenorphine make this issue especially obvious. For medication for opioid use disorder is evidence-based treatment. Federal disability law specifically recognizes that lawful use of a prescribed MOUD under appropriate medical supervision is not the same thing as current illegal drug use. So imagine a recovery organization saying, we will hire you as a peer, but only after you stop taking methadone. Think about what is happening there. The employer is not the person's physician. The employer did not conduct the medical evaluation. The employer is not managing the opiate use disorder. The employee is not prescribing the medication. Yet employment is being used as leverage to influence the person's treatment decision. That should make us extremely uncomfortable, especially in a field that claims to support medicated-assisted recovery. Sometimes stigma becomes easier to recognize when we change the medication. Imagine an employer saying, we'll hire you after you stop your antidepressant. Or, you can work here if you discontinue your ADHD medication. Or, we don't believe in seizure medication, so you'll need to stop that first. Or, your pain management treatment doesn't align with our philosophy. Or, you can have the job once you stop your medication for opiate use disorder. When we hear it that way, it becomes obvious. A workplace can establish standards, it can address safety, it can address performance. The medical treatment decisions should ordinarily remain between the patient and appropriately qualified healthcare professionals. There is another part of this I do not think it's talked about enough. Employment gives an organization power. Income pays rent. It buys groceries. It keeps the lights on. It provides insurance. It creates stability. It gives somebody purpose. So when employment is made conditional on stopping treatment, the employee is not making that healthcare decision in a neutral environment. They are being placed in a position where the choice may feel like my treatment or my paycheck, my medication or my career, my healthcare or my ability to support my family. That is significant pressure. And in behavioral health or recovery services, that pressure can be particularly contradictory. We tell clients, don't stop your medication because somebody stigmatizes you. Talk to your medical provider. Treatment should be individualized. Recovery is personal. Medication is not weakness. But if we turn around and tell an employee, you can work here once you stop that medication, then we have to ask whether we actually believe the principles we're teaching. Employment policy versus a definition of recovery. This distinction is critical. An employer might lawfully say, our workplace has a marijuana policy. That does not automatically mean the employer can truthfully say anyone who uses medical cannabis is not in recovery. Those are different claims. One is an employment rule. The other is a clinical and philosophical judgment about a human being's recovery. The same applies to medication generally. An employer may sometimes have a legitimate job-related restriction, but saying you cannot meet our definition of recovery because of the medication you take moves the conversation from workplace policy into stigma. And if that medication is treating a disability, it may also move the conversation into disability law. Now we're going to talk about California sober or Cali sober. This conversation overlaps with the idea people call California sober. That term can mean different things to different people. Usually, it describes someone who stopped using the substance or substances that were causing serious harm that may still use cannabis. And I don't particularly care whether somebody likes the phrase. What interests me is that what the phrase exposes. It challenges the idea that there is only one acceptable recovery endpoint. For one person, drinking one beer may be incredibly dangerous. For somebody else's recovering from opioid use disorder, occasional cannabis may have no connection whatsoever to the addictive behavior that nearly killed them. For someone else, cannabis may become the next substance they lose control over. Those are three different people. That is exactly why individualized treatment exists. Harm reduction doesn't require pretending substances have no risks. It means recognizing that risk exists on a spectrum and working with the actual person standing in front of us. This gets especially uncomfortable in peer recovery services. Peer support is built around lived experience. Peers are supposed to understand that recovery is personal. They're supposed to meet people where they are. They're supposed to promote autonomy. They're supposed to support the individual's goals. So what message are we sending when a person says, I am stable, I am no longer living the life I lived in active addiction, I am working, I am taking care of my responsibilities, I am giving back, my doctor and I have addressed my health, and the recovery field responds with, your recovery doesn't count because of your medication. Think about the weight of that statement, especially coming from another person in recovery. There is a difference between enforcing a legitimate organizational requirement and making somebody feel that their recovery is entirely fraudulent. That can be deeply stigmatizing. And stigma does not suddenly become acceptable because it comes from another recovering person. This is probably the comparison I keep coming back to. How many people taking methadone have heard, you're still getting high, you're still replacing one drug with another, you're not clean, come back when you're actually sober. We spent years trying to dismantle that thinking. And why? Because those beliefs hurt people. They drove people away from evidence-based treatment. They made people ashamed of taking medication that was helping them stay alive. And eventually, the treatment field had to confront the difficult truth. Personal recovery ideology is not the same thing as medical evidence. Now we're seeing versions of that same argument with other treatments. Different medication, same gatekeeping. We should recognize the pattern. Instead of asking only, what medication is this person taking? Maybe we should be asking, are they impaired? Can they perform the essential functions of their job? Are they stable? Are they meeting their responsibilities? Are they engaging in compulsive use? Are they experiencing a loss of control? Is the medication creating actual harm? Are they returning to behaviors associated with active addiction? Is there objective evidence of a safety problem? Are they following appropriate medical care? Are they reaching the goals identified for their recovery? Are they building a life worth protecting? Those questions tell us considerably more than the name of a medication ever could. SAMHSA's recovery framework has historically described 4 major dimensions that support recovery. Health, which is managing disease and symptoms and making informed choices that support physical and emotional well-being. Home, having a stable and safe place to live. Purpose, participating in meaningful daily activities such as work, school, volunteering, caregiving, or creative pursuits. Community, having relationships and social networks that provide support, friendship, love, and hope. Now think about employment. Employment itself can support purpose. Employment can support home because it provides income. Employment can improve access to healthcare. Employment can strengthen community. So if we take employment away from someone solely because we disapprove of their legitimate treatment pathway, we may actually be removing several of the things that support their recovery. That is worth talking about. For years, we have sometimes described recovery primarily through abstinence. I don't drink, I don't use heroin, I don't use cocaine, I don't take pills, I don't do this, I don't do that. Those things can absolutely be important. But recovery is also about what you've built. I show up for my kids, I go to work, I manage my health, I repair relationships, I take responsibility, I have boundaries, I recognize my triggers, I ask for help, I help someone else, I have somewhere safe to sleep. I'm not spending every morning figuring out how I'm going to avoid withdrawal. I'm not committing crimes to support my substance use. I'm alive, I'm present, I'm building something. That's recovery too. In fact, those changes may tell us far more about recovery than simply knowing which medications or substances are detectable in somebody's body. That is especially important for counselors, peers, social workers, medical providers, supervisors, and anyone else working with people who have substance use disorders. We all have biases. Our own recovery experiences create biases, our education, our workplace, our families, our culture. But professional responsibility requires us to recognize those biases rather than impose them on the person we're helping. A counselor who personally believes complete abstinence is best can still provide excellent care to someone whose recovery includes medication. A peer who personally chooses not to use cannabis. A peer who personally chooses not to use medical cannabis can still support somebody who uses it. A supervisor who personally would never take methadone should not be substituting that belief for another person's treatment plan. You don't have to choose another person's pathway. You don't have to believe that pathway would work for you. You simply have to understand their recovery is not yours. Individualized recovery does not mean anything goes. Someone should not come to work impaired. Someone should not drive impaired. A peer worker should maintain professional boundaries. Treatment programs have safety responsibilities. Employers have workplace responsibilities. Some jobs have legitimate medication-related restrictions. Some positions are heavily regulated. Some taking medications that can affect alertness or cognition need to understand potential interactions and risks. None of that disappears because we support multiple pathways, but decisions should be based on actual safety, actual impairment, actual essential job functions, actual evidence, actual regulation, and actual law. Not, I don't like that treatment. Those are not the same thing. When does a workplace policy become interference with healthcare? This may be the most important question in the entire episode. When does a legitimate workplace rule become interference with someone's medical care? There isn't one universal answer. The law depends on the medication, the disability, the job, the employer, the safety risk, the regulatory environment, and many other facts. But there is a useful principle. An employer has a legitimate interest in whether you can safely and effectively perform your job. That does not automatically give the employer a legitimate interest in controlling your treatment plan. So, if the concern is impairment, assess impairment. If the concern is safety, assess the safety. If the concern is essential job function, assess the job function. If an accommodation is possible, have the accommodation conversation. If a medical evaluation is a legitimate need, obtain information tied to the actual job concern. But if the only concern is management doesn't approve of the medication, then we should call it what it is. That's not individual assessment, that is judgment. And depending on the circumstances, it may also be discrimination. The question I want the recovery field to answer. So here's the question I think we need to wrestle with. If somebody has improved their health, if they're living a self-directed life, if they're working their potential or working towards their potential, if they're stable, if they're connected to their community, if they're supporting their family, if they're no longer engaging in the destructive substance use that once controlled their life, if they're performing their jobs safely, and if they're using a medically appropriate treatment, what part of the definition of recovery did they violate? Maybe there are cases where a medication or substance is interfering with their recovery. Absolutely, address it. Maybe there are cases where a medication creates a legitimate safety issue for a specific job. Address that too. But make that determination based on the individual. Don't start with the verdict and work backward. Recovery doesn't have to look the same in every person. That is not a weakness of the recovery movement. That's one of its strengths. Someone may recover through complete abstinence. Someone may recover with methadone. Someone may recover with buprenorphine. Someone with smart recovery or AA or NA. Someone may recover through therapy, incorporate faith. Someone may use peer support. Some may practice harm reduction. Someone may take psychiatric medication. Someone may need pain management treatment. And yes, there are people who consider themselves in recovery while using cannabis, including medical cannabis. We can discuss risks. We can debate policy. We can examine evidence. We can establish appropriate workplace standards. We can protect clients. We can protect employees. We can protect workplace safety. Those conversations are legitimate. But there are two things we should be extremely careful about doing. First is telling another human being that all the progress they've made doesn't count because their recovery doesn't look like ours. And the second is putting somebody in a position where they feel forced to choose between medical treatment and employment, simply because somebody else doesn't approve of their treatment pathway. Recovery was never supposed to be a purity test. It's supposed to be about change, health, stability, purpose, connection, autonomy, and building a life where addiction is no longer running the show. So maybe instead of asking, are you sober enough for me? We should ask, is your life getting better? And instead of asking, do I approve of your medication? Maybe employers should be asking, can you safely and effectively do the job? Those are very different questions and should change the way we treat people in recovery. This is Silence the Stigma, changing the conversation, expanding access, and saving lives.